Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing well. In today's video, I'm finally tackling a project that's been on my list for so long and I've just been putting off, and that is updating this thrifted quilted denim jacket. So I thrifted this from my local thrift store probably like over a year ago now, and I love this jacket. It's super warm and cozy. It's like a quilted denim on the outside, and on the inside it's sort of like a fleece material, so it's really nice and warm, and it's a really nice transitional spring and fall jacket as well. But the problem is the plaid, and I'm sure there's a lot of you out there who really like plaid and think that this jacket is awesome as it is, but plaid is just not for me, and I think it's stopping me from getting as much wear out of this jacket as it deserves. So when I first bought this jacket, I kind of looked at it and I thought, oh yeah, that would be super easy to update, just like a little bit of sewing. And then when I brought it home and started looking into more detail at what was actually going on with the plaid, I realized that it might be a little bit more work than I had initially thought. So I've been putting it off and haven't gotten around to it, and finally today decided to go ahead and just get it done. So I really don't know how this is going to turn out, but I thought I would film a video of it anyway, just because if I do a good job of it, then you guys can kind of learn along with my process with me, and if I totally bungle it up, then you can at least learn from my mistakes. But let's hope that doesn't happen. So for the color I've chosen, I have some leftover denim linen in my stash, and this is from a previous project that I did. I actually used this as lining for a Wixton jacket, and it's this really beautiful kind of like, I want to say sort of like a dusty navy blue. Like, it's not a dark denim color, but it's what's the color name? So this is the Washed Linen 2 in dark denim from Blackbird Fabrics. And it's 100% linen, so I was thinking I would use this because it's quite a similar color. It's not the exact same, so it'll still stand out a little bit, but I think it's just going to tone down this jacket a little bit and make it a little bit more wearable for me. So the three parts of this jacket that I need to update are this binding, which goes all the way around the jacket, and I think for that I'm going to try using what's called a fat quarter to make some bias binding, which I've never done before. Because it is quite long. It goes all the way around and then around the back and then up the other side as well. I also have to do the collar. So the collar has a bias binding around the edge, and then what looks kind of like two pieces in the middle. And this one I think is going to be the most difficult, just because I think it's sewn into the lining here, so I'm not really sure how I'm going to unpick it, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And then the last part is just this sneaky little part inside the sleeves here, which you don't really see a lot, but I just want to update anyway, just so that the whole jacket is using the new fabric. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here is one final look at what the jacket looks like before I go ahead and start ripping things apart. And I'm starting by taking off the bias binding that goes all the way around the front and bottom hem of the jacket. And you'll see throughout this video that I use my stitch unpicker in two ways. So here I'm just starting using the sharp edge of the blade to kind of pick at each stitch and go along. And later on in the video you'll see that I actually flip my seam ripper around and stick the red tip part into the actual seam and rip it that way, which I think is the proper way to use a seam ripper. It's definitely a lot faster, but I was just kind of using both methods to make sure that I was being as careful as possible and not ripping any part of the jacket that I wanted to keep. Ta-da! That was a lot of unpicking. So now on to making my bias binding. I watched a YouTube tutorial on how to do this, and so I'll link that somewhere on the screen for you here as well. But basically this is called taking a fat quarter, and what I did was just cut a square of fabric that I thought would be large enough for all of the bias binding that I would need. And then what you do is you fold the two corners on opposite sides in on each other, and it just took me a little bit of finessing to kind of get them all lined up properly. So once it's folded in half, you fold it again, and then you're going to cut straight into the folded fabric and create your strips. So first I'm just checking the bias binding that was used on the original jacket to check the width that I want to cut them at. And then I just cut my fat quarter down the center so that I would have two pieces to work with, and started cutting 2-inch pieces from the middle, which is the same width as the original bias binding. And so you'll see that each strip that you cut, you get a nice long strip of bias tape, and as you kind of go towards the edges, the strips get a little bit shorter and shorter, and then you can just sew them to connect them at the end. So now that I have a strip that's long enough to go around my entire jacket, I'm using my little bias tape maker, which is a really handy device. The only thing is, unfortunately, I think I kind of misjudged how far the edges of the bias tape on the original jacket were folded into the center. They weren't folded in quite all the way, so here I actually ended up with a narrower bias tape than what was on the original jacket. So I started by attaching the bias tape to the front of the jacket and pinning it from both the front and the back to try and stitch it all in one go, which I think is how it was attached on the original jacket. But as you'll see in a couple of minutes, I actually ended up unpinning it rather, and attaching the bias tape using the method that I normally use, which is to first stitch at a seam allowance with the right sides together, and then flip the bias tape to the inside and stitch in the ditch from the right side, catching the underside of the bias tape on the inside of the jacket. So it's a longer process, it does take 2 steps, and it is a little bit hard to stitch in the ditch and just make sure that you're catching everything. My best tip is just to use as many pins as possible to just make sure that you're catching that edge underneath. So yeah, here I'm unpinning what I've done and just going back to my usual method. And I found that this actually worked really well. It does give you a really nice and clean finish from the front because there's no top stitching along your bias tape. It's stitched in the ditch, so you don't see it from the front. And for the most part, it worked pretty well on this jacket. I did have to go back and stitch over a few places where I hadn't properly caught the underside. And then also around the buttons on the front, my presser foot just refused to go over them and went around them instead, so the lines were a little bit wonky along the front, but yeah, it's not perfect, and at the end of the day, it's good enough. Welcome back to day 2 of this project. So I finished the bias binding yesterday and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And I decided to stop because after I finished doing the bias binding, I actually really liked how the jacket looked with the little pop of color in the collar, and I was thinking to myself, oh, should I really redo the collar part and the sleeves. So I wasn't sure whether I should continue or not, but I woke up today and decided yes, I'm going to keep going with it, just because I really like the color of the linen binding and how it turned out, and I still think that I'm going to get more wear out of this jacket with the update. So today I still have to do the inside of the sleeves and then the collar, which are the more difficult aspects of doing this, and yeah, I'm just going to kind of make it up as I go along, so let's see what happens. So to start, I'm just taking my measuring tape and measuring the size of the sleeve lining that I need to make, and it was a little bit wider as I went up the jacket as opposed to towards the hem where it's a little bit narrower. So I just took note of all the measurements and then chalked it out onto my scrap fabric using a ruler and then cut out my piece. Okay, so I think what I'm going to have to do with the sleeve is unpick it from the top stitching seams here, but as you can see it's also stitched to the main fabric and the lining. So once I unpick this, I think I'll have a better idea of how to get at that part. And then to attach my new lining, what I'm going to do is stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance to create a circle. I think what I'm going to do is stitch it with the right side to the wrong side along the edge here, so like that, and then once that's stitched I can then flip it back in on itself and then tuck this part under and top stitch. So it's not exactly how it was originally constructed, and if I top stitch close enough to the edge here, there shouldn't be too much of an edge that's kind of sticking up, and this edge should be nice and firmly attached. The other thing that I was considering doing was doing the opposite, so stitching this along here like so and then folding it so that you get a nice clean line here, and then doing a bias binding around the hem, which would show on the outside. So yeah, I think I'll have a better idea of what I'm going to do once I unpick this. Okay, so I think I've decided that instead of doing a bias binding, I'm going to try and keep the jacket as close to the original as possible. So yeah, it's a little bit convoluted what I have to do here, but I think I'm going to flip this. So this is my longer side, which is going to end up closer up the arm, and the shorter side is the closest to the actual hem. So I just need to slip this inside here. No, that's wrong. It needs to be this way. Okay, this is correct. So I'm going to be putting the right side of my lining. You can see it's the wrong side facing up, so it's the right side facing the wrong side of the jacket. It's a little bit hard to see what I'm doing, but basically I'm going to pin this here to the inside. about 1/2 of an inch of the way down, and then when I fold it over, it's gonna look like that on the inside, and then all I have to do is fold this part under and then stitch it down to cover this lining part. So let's go ahead and get this all pinned and give it a try. So I'm really sorry that it's not super clear to see what I'm doing here. It's really hard to try and concentrate on what you're doing when you're sewing and capture it perfectly on camera as well. But basically I'm just attaching it to the sleeve with the right side to the wrong side, like I mentioned, and pinning it from the right side of the jacket so that I can top stitch it from the right side. So once it's all pinned in place, I can go ahead and turn the sleeve to the right side, and then I'm going to go ahead and top stitch very close to that edge. There was no stitching there before on the jacket, but thankfully the thread that I was using was a very similar color, so you can't really notice it, and it just creates a really clean line when you flip the lining to the inside. So before flipping the lining over, I decided just to quickly press it up at about a 1/2 inch or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, just so that it would be a lot easier for me to pin that down over the lining and just have a very crisp edge. Okay, so here is what the completed sleeve looks like. So I top stitched where the original jacket had stitching, which was here, and tried to catch that little under bit on the inside. I managed to get most of it. I had to go over again one part, and I think there's a couple little bubbles where it's not 100% attached, but that's okay. It's on the inside, so it won't really show anyway. So yeah, this is the inside. It's definitely not perfect here, where I was top stitching and couldn't see what I was stitching down. But yeah, for the most part, I think that's pretty good. It's sealed the lining in perfectly, so there's no like raw edges or anything like that. And it's nicely top stitched here, so it won't kind of peek out of the sleeve while you're wearing it. And yeah, that's one sleeve done. And now to repeat that entire process again on the other side.
20 minutes later.
Okay, I am done both of the sleeves now. I think I did a better job on my second one, which always seems to be the way that it goes. Once you've done it once, you know how to do it better the second time. So that was a lot faster than the first one, and both of those are now out of the way. So the final piece that I need to do is this collar. And this is the piece that I am the most unsure about, just because of this kind of second piece in there. Like, it's two pieces of fabric. I'm wondering if I can just be lazy and cut one. That might be what I do. We'll see. But I think for this one I'm going to start by unpicking it so that I can then take the piece out of here and use that to create the pattern. So I was able to get the bias binding off of the collar, but as you can see, I had to actually go into the neck kind of collar of the jacket, which is folded down on both sides. So I think if I were to unpick this piece along this seam, it's going to open up this whole top part of the jacket, and the collar is actually going to come out, which I don't think I really want to do, just because I think like pushing it back in with the new lining and then reattaching it might not look very good. So my plan for now is I've taken off the bias binding and it's opened up this little gap, and I think I'm going to unpick the edges of this lining around here, and then I think I'm going to trim it down like quite close to this line, and then I think I'm going to stitch my new lining on top of it, just so that I don't have to unpick this entire seam and rip the collar out of the jacket and have to put it back in again. So yeah, I'm gonna see how it goes, but that's the plan of attack so far. So that plan of attack went out the window pretty quickly because as I started unpicking the fabric, I realized that it was attached with just the batting in between, and I didn't want to unpick it in case I ripped a lot of the cotton batting out. So what I decided to do instead was actually just start making my pattern, just lying the fabric down on top of a spare piece of tracing paper, and then I decided to just stitch my linen fabric right over the plaid and didn't bother unpicking it at all. And thankfully my linen that I was using was opaque enough that the plaid of the fabric didn't show through, so this worked quite well and I didn't have to rip anything out, and yeah, I just didn't feel comfortable unpicking everything that was so close to the cotton batting in case it all kind of fell to pieces. Once I had a rough drawing of my pattern that I needed, I just folded it in half so that I would get it symmetrical on both sides, and then cut it out and left a little bit of extra seam allowance on the bottom edge when I was cutting into my fabric. And I actually overcalculated the amount of seam allowance that I was going to need, so I cut an extra 2 inches. I'm not sure why my brain was thinking that way. I really only needed an inch, but yeah, it was fine to just have the extra fabric. It's better to have more if you need it, not less. So here I'm attaching my new lining to the bottom edge of the collar, and I'm doing it in a very similar way to how I did the sleeve lining. So I'm attaching it to the wrong side of the fabric, and then I'm going to stitch it from the outside in the stitch line that was there originally, and then I'm going to flip it up and then secure the raw edge of the collar and the new lining using the bias binding. So here's how it looks now that the lining is stitched to the bottom, and this actually worked a lot better than I was expecting. I was thinking I was going to have to go back and go over it and that there would be some red plaid sticking out from the bottom, but I managed to stitch it perfectly and nothing was showing. So I just pinned the lining to the collar of the fabric, and here I'm just cutting off the excess, which was a result of me adding too much seam allowance. And then I'm just attaching my bias binding to the raw edge of the collar, which is using the same method that I did on the front of the jacket. So I'm attaching it from the right side at a seam allowance of 1/2 inch, and then I'll flip it over to the inside and fold it under and then stitch again from the front, stitching in the ditch to catch that underside edge on the inside of the jacket. And once the bias binding around the collar was attached, that was it for this jacket. So here's a quick look again one last time at how it looked before with all of the plaid lining and the plaid collar and sleeves. And here's the finished result with the new lining fabric. I'm really happy with how this turned out. It definitely tones down the jacket a lot. I just found the plaid with the red color especially really loud on this jacket, although I'm sure that there are some of you out there who will disagree with me, and I'm so sorry if that's the case, but this jacket, yeah, just suits me a lot more and my style, so I think I'm just going to get a lot more wear out of it this way. So I hope that you enjoyed watching this video and maybe learned some new sewing techniques or just got some inspiration for your own thrift flip or DIY projects at home. If you did enjoy this video, please don't forget to like it and also subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more in the future. I do a lot of sewing content, slow fashion, capsule wardrobes, and sustainability lifestyle. So I would love to have you here and would love to see you in the next video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.